The greatest myth we perpetuate in sports is that the champion is merely a machine of precision. We celebrate the perfect swing, the flawless execution. But what if the ultimate victory required nothing less than defying the very structure of the human body? Let us transport ourselves back to the hallowed grounds of Merion, Pennsylvania, 1950, a scene bathed in the nervous anticipation that only a U.S. Open can deliver. Yet the hush surrounding the first tee box was different that year. It was not the silence of reverence for the game, it was the silence of deep collective doubt. 15 months prior, a man was told he might never walk again. His body, once the finely tuned instrument of the game's greatest ball striker, was now a tapestry of surgical scars, held together by sheer, terrifying will. The question hanging in the humid air was not whether Hogan could win, but whether he could physically survive the journey. 72 holes in the crucible of a major championship requires stamina, focus, and physical endurance. For this man, every single step was a calculated act of defiance against medical science. This was the ultimate test of resiliencia sportiva. This was the Ritorno Ben Hogan. The doctors, the medical texts, the consensus of the age. They all declared the feat an act of super-assault impossible. The extensive injuries to his lower body meant that blood circulation was a constant, agonizing battle. He wore elastic bandages from ankle to hip, a corset of pain disguised as a foundation for movement. The public watched the hawk, stoic and seemingly unbreakable, but beneath the familiar visor, a war was being fought not against the field, but against the clock, the pain, and the overwhelming gravity of exhaustion. To witness Ben Hogan Merion in 1950 was to witness the triumph of force mental over physical frailty. It was a tournament where the scorecard was secondary to the simple, profound ability to put one foot in front of the other for 4 consecutive days. The journey ahead was merciless, the course was brutal, the pressure unfathomable. But for Ben Hogan, the greatest challenge wasn't sinking the putt, it was simply having the strength to walk to the next green. We invite you to consider, what is the single greatest example of mental fortitude you have ever witnessed in the gentleman's game? Comment your theory below. We shall delve into the dramatic final 18 holes of this legendary campaign next time. The U.S. Open of 1950, contested on the hallowed grounds of the Merion Golf Club in Pennsylvania, was never going to be a simple sporting event. It was, rather, a profound interrogation into the limits of human endurance, performed under the gaze of a captivated nation. 15 months prior, Benjamin William Hogan was given a prognosis that suggested retirement, perhaps even a life confined to a chair. The catastrophic injuries sustained in the bus crash, the shattered pelvis, the fractured collarbone, the near-fatal pulmonary embolism, had left him physically compromised in ways the casual observer could scarcely fathom. This was not merely a matter of recovering swing speed, this was a question of basic locomotion. Consider the physics of the challenge. A standard 18-hole round on a championship course like Merion requires a golfer to traverse, on average, 4 to 5 miles. Over the mandatory 4 rounds of the Open, this translates to roughly 20 miles of continuous walking. But Hogan, due to the severe blood circulation issues stemming from the trauma, required his legs to be tightly bound in elastic bandages, a constant painful compression meant to prevent the recurrence of the deadly clots. Every step was an act of deliberate, conscious agony. Dr. Beanies, one of the attending physicians, later mused that Hogan's return was less a medical miracle and more a testament to an unyielding, almost terrifying concentration of will. The muscles in his legs, perpetually weakened and prone to spasm, were forced to operate under extraordinary duress, mile after mile, day after humid day. The first 2 rounds were a tightrope walk of control and fatigue. The golf swing itself, famously precise and mechanically perfect, was Hogan's refuge. It was the one area where he could momentarily forget the throbbing, searing pain below the waist. He swung with the surgical detachment of a man operating on his own body, determined that if his legs were to fail him, his hands would not. By Sunday, the physical debt was crippling. His routine between rounds was brutal. Long, scalding baths designed to stimulate circulation, followed by painstaking stretching, all while managing the psychological terror that a clot could break free at any moment. He entered the final round 5 strokes behind the leader, Lloyd Mangrum. Merion demands patience, yet Hogan needed urgency. He fought the course, the competition, and the overwhelming desire to simply sit down. The pressure mounted as he reached the 18th. He needed a par to tie Mangrum and George Fazio, forcing an 18-hole playoff the following day. Standing 200 yards out, facing the daunting final green, Hogan pulled the legendary club from his bag, the 1-iron. This was not a choice. It was a necessity. To swing a long iron with the force required while battling total physical exhaustion is perhaps the greatest mental feat in the history of the gentleman's game. He struck the ball with that flawless, powerful fade, watching it settle perfectly on the green. He made the putt, a par, a tie. And there is one more detail you cannot imagine, a detail that speaks volumes about the level of his physical torment. When the tournament rules dictated an 18-hole playoff on Monday, meaning an additional 4 or 5 miles of walking, Hogan did not simply endure. He dominated. He shot a 69, 4 strokes better than Mangrum and 6 better than Fazio. He did not just win, he established an unassailable margin. The consensus among those who witnessed it was that Hogan's body, after 72 holes, should have been utterly spent. Yet the sheer force of his competitive spirit, the absolute refusal to surrender the victory he had walked 20 miles to earn, propelled him through those final, painful strides. This was not a story of a golfer winning a major. It was the story of a man rebuilt from fragments, demonstrating that the human spirit, when properly focused, can compel a broken body to perform the impossible. He proved that the will to walk was, in fact, the will to win. Who was there that afternoon, watching the hawk limp slightly toward the scoring tent, understood that they had witnessed the physical definition of grit. For more stories that molded this sport, stories of triumph, tradition, and the occasional heartbreak, consider subscribing. We'll see you at the next tee. The Merion Golf Club outside Philadelphia is a place where history whispers through the towering oaks and the subtle slopes of the greens. But in June of 1950, Merion was not merely a venue for the U.S. Open. It was the ultimate proving ground for a man whose very presence defied the laws of medicine. 15 months prior, Ben Hogan had been told he might never walk without assistance again. The collision had left him with a constellation of injuries, most critically the double fracture of the pelvis and a near-fatal blood-clotting issue that forever compromised the circulation in his legs. The fundamental challenge Hogan faced at Merion was not the insidious rough or the treacherous bunkers. It was the relentless, cumulative trauma of vertical movement. To truly understand the magnitude of his effort, one must look beyond the scorecard and into the anatomy. The average golfer walks approximately 5 to 6 miles during a round of 18 holes. In a major championship, completing 72 holes requires covering nearly 24 miles, a distance equivalent to a marathon. Now, imagine attempting this feat with your body's primary circulatory system severely damaged. For Hogan, every step was a battle against gravity and biology. The blood, struggling to return from his extremities, would pool in his lower limbs. Medically, this condition required constant management. Hogan was forced to wear specially designed elastic stockings, tightly wrapped from ankle to thigh. These were not merely athletic supports, they were essential medical devices, acting as external pumps to push the blood back toward his heart. Without them, the swelling and the risk of new clots would have ended his tournament almost immediately. The tension in the air was palpable, yet it was dwarfed by the tension within Hogan's muscles. He walked stiffly, his gait mechanical, preserving every ounce of energy for the precise, violent explosion of the swing. It was the ultimate dichotomy, a body screaming in agony, controlled by a mind operating with surgical precision. He played through the week, relying on the sheer muscle memory that had made him the premier ball striker of his generation. The pain was so intense that between rounds he was often submerged in hot baths, desperately trying to loosen the stiffness and drain the fluid buildup. This was not the relaxing soak of a champion. It was a desperate attempt to reset the body for another 4 miles of torment. As Sunday's final round progressed, the drama intensified. Hogan found himself tied with Lloyd Mangrum and George Fazio. He stood on the 18th tee, needing a par to secure his place in the Monday playoff. The hole required a demanding approach shot. Hogan, leaning on his trusty iron 1, struck a legendary blow that settled perfectly on the green. It was a shot born not of confidence but of sheer unyielding necessity. And there is one more detail you cannot imagine, a small yet profound testament to his suffering. Hogan had instructed his caddy to place small, smooth pebbles in his shoes before the start of each round. This was a crude, desperate form of pain distraction, a minor, localized agony designed to momentarily override the deeper systemic suffering in his hips and legs. The Monday playoff demanded another 18 holes, an extra 4 miles, an extra 3 hours of agony. Hogan's performance that day remains one of the greatest acts of mental fortitude in sporting history. While his opponents struggled under the pressure of the moment, Hogan, perhaps immune to external stress due to his internal battle, shot a brilliant 69. He dominated the playoff, but the victory cost him dearly. When he finally walked off the 18th green, not as a golfer but as a survivor, he collapsed, utterly spent. The physical toll was so immense that he lost 10 pounds during the championship week, primarily due to dehydration and the continuous internal fight against inflammation. The 1950 US Open at Merion was not just a major victory, it was a defining moment for the human spirit. It proved that the will to walk, backed by an unparalleled commitment to the craft, could temporarily conquer the limitations of the flesh. Ben Hogan didn't just win a title that week. He completed a pilgrimage, transforming a brutal physical challenge into a legend of immortality. For those who witnessed it, the sight of Hogan, pale and determined, marching across the hallowed ground of Merion, remains the purest definition of the gentleman's game. For more stories that shaped this sport, and for a deeper dive into the legends who walked these fairways, consider joining us. We'll see you at the next tee. The calendar had flipped to June of 1950, and the grand, uncompromising contours of the Merion Golf Club were ready to host the 50th US Open. Yet the story unfolding was not merely about a major championship. It was a profound testament to the human spirit's refusal to yield to the limits of the flesh. 15 months removed from the collision that nearly claimed his life, Ben Hogan arrived in Ardmore, Pennsylvania, not as the reigning champion, but as a medical marvel still tethered to mortality. The trauma was immense. A fractured pelvis, twice a shattered collarbone, and the insidious threat of blood clots that demanded near-constant compression wrapping around his legs, a necessity that profoundly restricted his movement. Merion, famously designed by Hugh Wilson, is a course built for thinkers but above all for walkers. 72 holes across 4 days demand endurance even from the fittest athlete. For Hogan, every step was a calculated negotiation with agony. The medical consensus was clear. Completing 72 holes, let alone competing against the world's elite, was an impossibility. The secret to Hogan's presence lay not just in his legendary resolve, but in a meticulously planned, almost surgical approach to physical conservation. He developed a gait, often described as wooden or stiff, designed specifically to minimize the rotation and shear forces on his reconstructed hip joints. He swung the club with a precision that bordered on the obsessive, not just because he sought perfection, but because every wasted motion, every unnecessary muscle engagement cost him precious energy he could not afford to lose. The very act of walking 18 holes placed an extraordinary burden on his cardiovascular system, already compromised by the blood clotting issues. Imagine, if you will, hiking 4 miles carrying an invisible burden, knowing that if you stumble, the internal damage could be catastrophic. This was Hogan's reality on the first tee box. The early rounds were a masterclass in psychological warfare against his own body. When the pain began to spike, typically around the 14th hole each afternoon, as the necessary anti-inflammatories began to wane, Hogan would retreat further into his shell of concentration. His famed stoicism was not merely temperament, it was a survival mechanism. He needed absolute focus to maintain the rhythm that kept his fragile frame moving. And there is one more detail you cannot imagine, a small but critical piece of the puzzle that allowed the Hawk to survive the rigors of Merion. Due to the intense compression bandages required to manage his circulation, which constricted the blood flow like a tourniquet, Hogan had to consume an extraordinarily high volume of fluids during his rounds. Dehydration, even slight, risked dangerous cramping and the seizing up of muscles in his lower extremities. He was essentially hydroengineering his own body to prevent a collapse on the back nine. As the tournament reached its climactic Sunday, Hogan found himself tied with Lloyd Mangrum and George Fazio. The ultimate test of his physical will was now at hand. An 18-hole playoff on Monday, an entire extra round, an extra 4 miles of walking. The playoff was less a golf match and more a contest of attrition. Mangrum and Fazio, though physically sound, could not match Hogan's relentless mental discipline. Hogan, leveraging his unparalleled ball striking, hit 17 greens in regulation. The precise, almost brutal efficiency of his game was the counterpoint to his internal suffering. The defining image of that week, a photograph now etched into the very granite of golf history, was taken on the 72nd hole, the 18th in the final round. Tied for the lead, Needing a par to secure his spot in the playoff, Hogan stood on the fairway, 213 yards from the pin. He pulled the one-iron, a club few professionals today dare to wield. The ensuing strike was pure. The ball soared, settling safely on the green. It was a shot of surgical precision, yes, but its true significance lies in the physical cost. That swing required full rotation, a movement that minutes earlier would have been agonizing. But in that moment, fueled by sheer unadulterated will, Hogan found the necessary freedom. He went on to win the playoff by 4 strokes. The score, however, was secondary. The victory at Merion 1950 was not about the trophy. It was about the validation of a life. It proved that a man, broken and scarred, could not only return to the arena, but could conquer it. Hogan didn't just win the US Open that year, he completed the course. He achieved the impossible feat of walking 90 holes. He demonstrated that the greatest obstacle in the gentleman's game often lies not in the distance of a drive or the speed of a green, but in the internal fortitude required simply to stand on the tee box and take the first step. The will to walk became the will to win. For more stories that capture the quiet dignity and fierce determination that mold the legends of this ancient sport, consider subscribing. We'll see you at the next tee. Merion Golf Club, 1950. The air was thick with expectation, yet heavier still with a deep unspoken skepticism. The question hanging over the US Open was not if Ben Hogan could still strike a ball, but if the human frame could endure the crucible of a championship walk after such comprehensive trauma. 15 months prior, a man was nearly cleaved in two. Now that same man, known for his stoic discipline and almost supernatural control, was attempting to conquer a course that demands immense physical integrity. To appreciate the scale of this undertaking, one must understand the physiology of the challenge. Hogan's body was a landscape of surgical repair. The double fracture of the pelvis meant the core stability required for the modern golf swing, the rotation and torque, was compromised perhaps permanently. But the greater enemy was the constant grinding pain of locomotion. A typical US Open course, particularly Merion with its demanding topography and lengthy transitions between holes, requires a player to cover between 18 and 20 miles over 4 days. For an average athlete, this is demanding. For Hogan, who suffered from circulatory issues and severe pain that necessitated the tight binding of his lower extremities with elastic bandages, every step was an act of defiance. Imagine the compression. Every time Hogan planted his lead foot, the impact reverberated through the compromised hip and pelvis. Doctors had warned that prolonged walking could reactivate the life-threatening blood clots that had nearly claimed him in the hospital. He wasn't just playing golf, he was navigating a medical tightrope where the slightest misstep could be fatal. By the time Sunday arrived, Hogan was running on pure distilled will. His routine was Spartan: a warm bath to loosen the seized muscles, the painful application of the bandages, and then the slow, deliberate march back onto the course. The gallery noticed his gait, a slight stiffness, a guarded economy of movement. He was conserving energy not just for the swing, but for the fundamental act of walking the next 300 yards. When he finished the 72 holes tied with Lloyd Mangrum and George Fazio, the collective exhale of the golfing world was mixed with dread. The rules demanded an 18-hole playoff the following day. 90 holes of championship golf in 5 days for a man whose medical charts suggested he should still be confined to a therapeutic pool. The playoff was not merely a test of skill, it was a test of survival. On Monday, as the three men walked the fairways of Merion, Hogan's opponents were battling fatigue. Hogan was battling gravity and the limitations of the human body. He won the playoff decisively, carding a 69, 4 strokes better than his nearest rival. This victory redefined courage in the gentleman's game. It wasn't just about the numbers on the card. It was about the simple, profound act of putting one foot in front of the other, 90 times over the length of the golf course. Ben Hogan did not just win the 1950 US Open. He proved that the mind, when focused and unyielding, can command the flesh to achieve the impossible. He walked into immortality on legs that were medically supposed to fail. The legacy of Merion 1950 is not a shot, but a stride. It is the definitive portrait of the hawk, reserved, intense, and utterly unwilling to surrender to the limitations imposed upon him. For more stories from the hallowed grounds of golf, where history is made with every swing, please consider subscribing. Share your thoughts below on the greatest physical feat ever accomplished on the links. We'll see you at the next tee.